What's up, everybody? Today I'm here to talk about the top 5 most disturbing books that I have read, as well as movies that I have seen. And this is a video I just thought I would make something a little bit different, I guess, and give me a chance to talk about some of the more extreme stuff that I have experienced in media. So just to give you guys a little bit of background, extreme horror isn't a genre that I am super well versed in. I enjoy reading some extreme horror books from time to time. I do have my limits, however. Some of you, if you're watching, who are maybe more seasoned in like exploitation, splatterpunk, that sort of thing, might be a little bit disappointed with this list, or might find even some of these entries to be a bit tame compared to what you've experienced. However, this is just the most disturbing media that I've experienced personally, and I do have my limits. I don't really plan on venturing much further, if at all further, than what I've already experienced here in this list. And for the sake of this video, I will be going from like least disturbing, I guess, to most disturbing. However, it was kind of tough to decide between most of these in my top 5 because they're all kind of disturbing in their own way. And yeah, but for the sake of it, I just ordered them to make things more streamlined. And yeah, let's just get right into it. I have 3 books here I want to talk about, as well as 2 movies. And of course, there are many other entries that I could have included here. I probably could have done like a top 10 or something, but I just decided to stick to like a top 5. The ones that just really shocked me the most, or just upset me, or made me the most depressed. These are pieces of media that I would not recommend to most people. You have to know what you're getting yourself into and what to expect in this subgenre. And like I already mentioned, this is a subgenre that I am not a big fan of. It's something I can experience once in a while, and even then, I go in with a bit of hesitation. I always do a bit of research. I'm not going to expose myself to everything that's out there, and I know there's much, much worse and more explicit and graphic like films and books out there than the ones I'll be talking about. But I just don't care for that. I read and watch movies and books mostly for entertainment, but occasionally I get myself into the kind of stories we'll be talking about in this video. So yeah, let's just jump right into it. So coming in at number 5 is Peaceable Kingdom by Jack Ketchum. This is a short story collection by Jack Ketchum. I believe it's the only short story collection that he released. I've read a few novels by this author, and in this book, has quite the variety of short stories in here. This is not a book that I would say is like super disturbing as a whole. You have a couple of like goofy creature feature, like animal attack stories in here. There's one about like killer snakes. You also have a really like comedic story in here called, what was it? The Great Sleazy San Diego Bimbo Massacre, or something along those lines. And it's just a super comedic story about these 2 women planning to kill their husbands, essentially. So yeah, you have quite a variety of stories in this collection. However, the most disturbing short stories that I have ever read in my life have come from this book. There are 2 in particular that I find to be probably the most disturbing. And those ones are If Memory Serves is the name of the first story. And it's basically about this girl who was traumatized, who went through some pretty crazy stuff. She was basically captured and tortured, and a lot of bad things happened, and I don't want to get into too much detail and spoil it. And she is currently in like the present time of the story. She is like visiting, I believe, like her therapist or something, and reliving her past and talking to him about it, trying to overcome this trauma that she now faces from these just horrific past events that she experienced. And there's a lot of detail that she goes into about her past. And even though it doesn't happen in the story, there's no like present scenes of like the events she experienced, just her reliving what happened to her in the past and going into detail about the things done to her. It was just very difficult to read. It was horrifying. I'm pretty sure I like skimmed through some of the stuff in the story because I was just so repulsed by it. And yes, it was extremely disturbing. The story made me very uncomfortable. It was well written. as is most of Jack Ketchum's work. I will say that Jack Ketchum is not the kind of author like other authors of splatterpunk might be, where they are aiming to write just simply to shock or gross out. I think Jack Ketchum writes with a little bit more sophistication. But yeah, this story, if memory serves, was one of the most disturbing ones in this entire book. And yeah, it was rough to read. One of the most effed up short stories I've ever read in my life. And then there's like a big twist to the story, like at the end, about how the main character, who is talking to her therapist and trying to overcome this past trauma, how she might not overcome it, and there are things that happen, and maybe her past comes back to like haunt her. That's kind of as much as I can say without like spoiling the big twist in the ending to the story. But yeah, that story was super effed up. Then the other story in here that was also very disturbing to me was called Twins. And Twins is basically, how I've described it, is it's the X-rated version of Flowers in the Attic. If you've read Flowers in the Attic or have any idea about that, infamous book and movie that was made, you kind of know what it's about. And yes, this story is disgusting. It is gross. And this is another one that is well written, and I can appreciate what the author was trying to do with the story, and he achieved his goal of writing something messed up. But at the same time, I feel like some kind of underlying themes to it a little bit, and there's like a little bit of, I don't know, meaning there, I guess you could say. But man, this story was absolutely disgusting, repulsive, and yeah. Jack Ketchum does not shy away from the more explicit details, and Twins is also one of the most disturbing short stories I've ever read in my life. So yeah, those were the two that I remember the most from this book. However, there were many other stories in this collection that I also had to like kind of skim through a little bit. Like, I was just so shaken up by this book. And not the book as a whole, but a lot of the stories in here, like I said. So yeah, Peaceable Kingdom, while it has some of the most disturbing stories in it, I decided to put it at the bottom because it is a short story collection. It has a lot of variety, and not all of the stories in here are of that more extreme nature. In fact, there's even one story in here that's more of like a sad story. It does have some disturbing elements to it, but on a more subtle level. It's almost more of like a feel-good type of story, but it has kind of like a sad, bittersweet ending. I believe the name of it is Sunday, if I remember correctly. It's basically about this guy and his pet squirrel, and I really enjoyed that story. So yeah, there's quite the variety of stories in here, like I've already mentioned. But yeah, some of them are just really effed up. All right. The second thing I'm going to talk about, coming in at number 4 on my list, is a movie. And the movie is I Saw the Devil. This is a Korean suspense thriller movie that came out, I believe, in like 2010, I want to say. And this movie is basically about this woman that is killed by this serial killer. And the husband happens to be a detective. And the detective basically kind of figures out who did it, or he has an idea of who did it. There's been this serial killer has like been on the loose for a while and killing people and capturing people and claiming victims. And the police department, I think, has been like kind of on the lookout for this guy, trying to find him and figure out who he is exactly. And this guy, the police detective, the husband of this woman that was killed, basically decides to play vigilante and go after this serial killer guy on like a revenge mission, basically. And what ensues is him getting way in over his head. He does end up getting revenge on this guy, but not in the way that you would expect. It's turns into like a really intense thriller movie, a game of cat and mouse as he pursues the serial killer. And the tables may turn at some point in the movie. I'm kind of remaining vague because I don't want to give anything away. And the serial killer may be like after the police detective then. And yeah, this is a very intense movie. And the reason I put it on my list of most disturbing movies is because not only is it very intense, and there's some very shocking twists and turns in this movie that completely caught me off guard, But there's a lot of just very graphic scenes in this movie. The serial killer does some horrible things to people. There is some SA stuff in this movie, so be warned of that. That is something that is very difficult for me to watch. I do not enjoy that at all. That is probably one of, if not like the most difficult thing to view on film or read about in books. I do not enjoy that whatsoever. So yes, the serial killer is just this horrible person doing these bad things to people. And we do get some pretty graphic scenes and imagery of that. But the reason I put it on this list is not only is it disturbing, is looking back at this movie, I actually kind of enjoy it. This is a very well-made film, very well written, well directed. And looking back, I'm glad I watched this movie, as difficult as it is to watch. And this is also a movie that has some layers to it and some themes. It's kind of like a commentary a little bit on revenge and how it's kind of bittersweet, and how taking revenge on someone doesn't always have the desired outcome. And yeah, there's a little bit of like layers and meaning through this movie you can kind of dig through a little bit. And it is very dark, like I already mentioned, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone because of how graphic it can be. But I enjoyed this movie. It's not a movie I'll ever watch again, but very well made movie. If you can handle this kind of thing and you know what you're getting into, I would maybe recommend checking this out. But yeah, I Saw the Devil comes in at number 4 and is the first of 2 movies on this list. So yeah. Okay, coming in at number 3, let me see, I have a couple of books here. And these ones are, I'm not really sure, kind of tied, I guess. I'll talk about, I don't know, I couldn't decide where to place these books in my number 3 and 2 spots. I'll just talk about this one first, I guess, since I just finished reading it and it's pretty fresh in my memory still. This is Full Brutal by Christopher Triana, however you pronounce his name. So yes, this is my 3rd spot on the most disturbing books and movies list. And this book, I just finished reading, and it is definitely one of the most disturbing things I've ever experienced. It's basically about this high school girl that the story is told in first person, completely from her point of view. And the story opens with her wanting to lose her virginity, basically. So we learn right off the bat that this girl, there's something wrong with her. She's lacking emotion, empathy. She just feels kind of indifferent to the world and life itself. And she has suicidal thoughts. She doesn't really care about anyone. She's a very selfish person. We learn a lot about her just within the first couple of chapters. And not from her like telling us, even though it's written in first person, just based on her thoughts and her actions and her behavior. And this is all like covered up behind this act, this persona she puts on. And at school, she gets perfect grades. She's a cheerleader. She's like kind of popular at school. She has some friends. No one suspects that Kim, the main character of the book, is the way that she is. No one has any idea. Her parents, her mom, I think, died when she was a kid, and her father, she doesn't really have a close relationship with her father, and he's part of some big business, and he's off on business trips all the time and away from home, so Kim basically just has the house to herself. And yeah, the story opens with her wanting to lose her virginity because she's just bored with life, borderline suicidal. She wants a big change, and she hears her high school friends gossiping and talking about boys and things like that. And so she thinks maybe if she loses her virginity, then it will be some kind of like life-altering experience for her. However, what she decides to do, instead of just sleeping with some guy at high school, she decides to seduce one of her teachers. And from there, she discovers that the act itself is not what she was looking for. It didn't really provide her with some kind of happiness or sensational like experience or life-altering perspective like she was expecting it to. What she discovers is that she got pleasure from seeing her teacher humiliated and embarrassed by this act. And she sort of uses this to kind of blackmail him and torture her teacher and toy with them and kind of threaten him to or threaten to like tell other people about it and start rumors. And from there, she embarks on a journey of self-discovery, just as she learns about her own like socio as well as psychopathic tendencies. And throughout the book, she continues to manipulate and betray people and like backstab them and basically orchestrate these scenarios where people are just embarrassed and humiliated, and eventually things get worse, things escalate quite quickly. Instead of just embarrassing and humiliating people, we eventually get characters who die because of her, not necessarily directly. Well, she does murder some people in the story, but she basically lies to some characters and tells, for example, like one person is responsible because of something. And yeah, she basically is just starting all of this drama and gossip and kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but I read a review on Goodreads about this book, and someone compared this book to American Psycho and I think Mean Girls, the movie. I'm not super familiar with those movies. I haven't seen them, but I would say that's a pretty accurate comparison. This is basically about a high school girl. She's 16 years old. She is completely evil, psychopathic, and yeah, she just does a lot of crazy, evil shit, and she gets off on watching people suffer. And throughout the book, things escalate and get worse, and she commits a lot of very vile and depraved acts. And there's some very just disturbing and gross stuff that happens in this book. And I did not enjoy it at all. So, Christopher Triana is an author that I've been wanting to check out for some time. He's an author that I've seen pop up a lot on Goodreads. You know, I've seen some of his reviews for his books like on YouTube and such. And so I kind of just bought this book a little bit on impulse, wanting to try one of his works. And this ended up being just a little bit too much for me, honestly. And it's not necessarily the vile and like depraved acts in this book that really got to me, although there are many of those, I will admit it. There's some very, very graphic and vivid imagery in this book, violence, essay. There's necrophilia in this book. Yeah. All of the trigger warnings you can find are pretty much in this book. But what really got to me about it is not necessarily all of those scenes, and there really wasn't like any one scene in this book where I was just like, oh my god, it just shocked me and I had to put it down or anything like that. What got to me the most about this book is the fact that we are basically living inside of Kim's head. Again, this is written in first person, and we are just living inside her thoughts, her inner monologue for like the entire length of this book. There are no other characters that we follow. The rest of the characters in this book are basically just victims of Kim. This is like reading her private journal entries, the journal of this crazy serial killer girl. And it was a very depressing and bleak read. And it just has this aura of negativity to it that really got to me. And at parts of this, throughout a lot of it, as a matter of fact, I found myself mentally just kind of like checking out as my glazed eyes just kind of like skimmed through the pages. I'm just like, man, I can't handle this book. This is just too much. It's just too depressing. And yeah, I did not like the way this book made me feel. It made me uncomfortable. And it did not make for a fun read. So yeah, this wasn't necessarily a bad book. I would say I think connoisseurs of extreme horror, of splatterpunk, you might enjoy this a lot more than I did. It's just too bleak for my tastes. And I want to have at least something to gravitate to like kind of towards or to kind of like latch onto in these types of books. There has to be like at least a small light at the end of the tunnel, some kind of like hope, or at least some kind of likable character that you can root for. There's nothing in here like that. You're just following Kim as she contemplates on and relishes on like her evil and twisted plans she comes up with to kill people and ruin people's lives, and how she only gets pleasure from violence and inflicting harm upon others. And when she's not doing any of these things, she's having suicidal thoughts and thinking about killing herself. This book was just a very dark and depressing book that I will never read again, and I can't recommend it. But again, if you're someone who is really into this subgenre and you've read a lot of stuff like this, this might be up your alley. I can appreciate what the author was going for with this book, but it's just not for me. So yeah, that's Full Brutal by Christopher Triana. I gave this book, I guess I didn't really give ratings for my first two entries, but this one I gave like a 2.5, actually not quite, like a 2.25 out of 5 stars. So yeah, that's my third pick for my top 5 list. So yeah, Full Brutal. Coming in at number 2 is Depraved by Brian Smith. And I can't remember if I read this book last year, or I think it was a couple years ago when I read this now. And the reason I picked this book up and wanted to read it is it's kind of like a backwoods type horror story. And if you watch my video where I talk about my top 5 favorite horror subgenres, that one is on there. I love backwoods horror dealing with like hillbilly cannibals. I don't know why, it's just a subgenre I really enjoy. So I thought I'd pick this book up, and I was aware that this was more of an extreme horror novel going into this, but I was not prepared for how extreme that it was. I had never read anything by Brian Smith previously, and this book was far more shocking than I expected it to be. And also at the time when I read this, I hadn't read a ton of extreme horror. I'd read a couple of Jack Ketchum books and like a few Richard Lehman novels at that point. And I think that was like all I had read at the time. So I wasn't as well experienced in the subgenre. So this one I think shook me to the core a little bit more than some of the previous entries I've talked about, which is why I decided to put it at my number 2 spot. However, another reason I'm putting it up here on this list is not only was it disturbing, but I actually quite enjoyed this book. Looking back, it shocked me, I think, a little bit too much for me to really think about the fact that I did like it at the time of reading it. But after finishing it and looking back upon it, I did enjoy this book, and I have since sought out other books by Brian Smith, and I've read one other book by him. But anyway, going back to this one, this book is basically about our main character. Her name is Jessica Sloan, and she goes into this small town. Kind of a stereotypical setup for this type of story, where she goes into this small town in the middle of nowhere with woods and a forest around, and there's these suspicious like hillbilly type characters. And it turns out that there's a lot of bad stuff that goes on in this town. I believe the name of the town is called Hopkins Bend, if I remember correctly. And we also follow some other side characters that also get lost. They make a wrong turn and get lost in this small town of Hopkins Bend. And they are all soon victims, or soon to be victims, of the crazy mutant hillbillies that live in this town, basically. And from there, just a lot of really bad things ensue. Kind of what you would expect, par for the course for this type of story. There's a lot of murder in this story. There are scenes of SA. There's quite a bit of essay in this book content. And yeah, again, that is something I don't enjoy reading about. This book does not shy away from the nitty-gritty details. It can be very graphic and visceral at times. And yeah, however, I did enjoy reading this because it's very suspenseful. And you have a character to root for in the main character of Jessica Sloan. And she's not some like helpless character who's like running around screaming. She's actually kind of a badass, and she fights back against some of these hillbillies. She manages to kind of not escape from the town entirely, but she's managing to like kind of stay underground and like hiding out, and she has weapons, and she manages to fight off some of these characters. And she also meets up with some other characters along the way, and they are plotting to figure out how to escape from this town. And then we also follow some of the other hillbilly characters in this town who don't agree with the lifestyle of the rest of them, who aren't quite as depraved and malevolent as the rest of these people, and they also want to escape and like start a new life. And yeah, so there's kind of a lot going on in this book. There's quite a few different characters we follow. And I think even though this book was extremely disturbing, do not get me wrong, the title of the book is very fitting for the content and some of the scenes that take place in this book. But even though it is very depraved, I enjoyed this quite a bit because of how tense and suspenseful it was. And it's a much more enjoyable read than, say, Full Brutal, because you actually have characters to root for in here. You want them to survive and escape, in which I don't want to give too much away and spoil anything, but some of them do, not all, of course. Some of them meet very grisly fates. But yeah, there is like a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, I guess you could say, with this book. And this book also has some sequels to it. I believe there's like 4 books in this series. Eventually, I might read the others. I don't really know yet. But yeah, I enjoyed this book. I gave it like a 3.5 out of 5 stars. But this is not for the faint of heart. There is some very graphic stuff in here. There's one scene in this book that borders on like the comedic territory for how absurd and ridiculous that it was. I don't think it was intended to be serious at all. I'm pretty sure it was meant as like dark humor or dark comedy, because there's one scene where a certain side character meets his end. He dies in a very just, I don't even know how to describe it, and it's not something I can even tell you guys in this video. It's not safe for work, but it is, yeah. It's completely absurd in the way this character dies, and I think it's meant as dark humor. So there is a little bit of like comedic relief in the story, I guess you could say. So yeah, this is more of a light, more of a fun extreme horror novel, if that makes sense. It's not as bleak and depressing as like Full Brutal was. So yeah, I enjoyed this book quite a bit, but again, go into this knowing that all the trigger warnings you can think of are in this book pretty much. So yeah, that's Depraved, coming in at number 2. Okay, and then my number 1 pick for the most disturbing piece of media that I have ever experienced. And it is the other movie. I mentioned that there were 2 movies on this list, and it is the other movie, and that is none other than Martyrs. I decided to put this at number 1. This is a French movie, I believe, and I can't remember the year this one came out. I want to say like 2008 or 2007, around there. And I just want to say before I get into this movie that there is a American remake of this movie that I think some people get it confused with, that came out many years later, like 2015 or something. I have not seen it, but do not watch it. From what I've heard, it is terrible. It is nothing like the original. So I am talking about the original French version of this movie, Martyrs, that came out in like 2008 or whenever it was. I'll post a picture of up here of it somewhere on the screen. And yeah, I decided to put this movie at number 1 because out of all of the books and movies that I've talked about thus far, I think this one made me the most uneasy and made me just the most unsettled and depressed. And I was just, yes, very uncomfortable watching this. Martyrs is basically about this girl. The movie opens up with a scene where this girl is basically chained up in this room in like this big abandoned warehouse. And she's essentially being tortured. And she's very young. She's a child. And she manages to escape somehow. I can't remember the fine details of how she escapes, but she breaks free. She manages to run away. The movie opens up with her scarred and bloody and beaten. But she manages to break free of her shackles somehow and runs away from this warehouse where she's being imprisoned and tortured at. And then we cut to many years later, and she is in this orphanage where she is, or like this foster home where she's being cared for, along with these other children. And we follow her throughout her life as she tries to return to a more normal, stable life where she's being taken care of. However, she is very traumatized by what she went through. She suffers from very poor mental health. She's having a lot of like hallucinations, things like that. She's haunted by like this demon entity thing, and there's a lot going on. She's very traumatized by what happened, understandably so. And then we also have like another time jump, which cuts to years later when she is no longer living in this foster home. I believe she's in her 20s at this point. She's like a young woman, and she has one friend that she made, a really close friend, growing up in like this orphanage. And this woman decides, I forget the names of these characters. It's been a little while since I've seen this movie, but she decides to go and get revenge on these people that tortured her. And she goes to where she thinks these people are, or I think she actually knows. She knows where these people are. She goes, she gets revenge on them. She does succeed. I'm going to kind of remain vague here a little bit, again, to avoid spoilers. She does succeed in getting revenge on some of these people that were responsible for her torture and for taking her captive, that kind of thing. Her friend thinks that she might be kind of going crazy from what happened to her a long time ago, and maybe isn't getting revenge at all, but just killing innocent people. She doesn't quite 100% believe her. But she is very close to her and wants to help her. So she kind of goes along with it a little bit. And then there is this big twist. After this act of revenge is committed by this girl who was tortured, there is this big twist, like at like the halfway point in this movie, or around there, where things are not what they appear. There are some other characters that come into play again. It's kind of hard to talk about this movie without spoiling it. There's this big twist, and things get crazy, and I don't really know how else to put it or go any further without giving it away. So I guess I'll just stop there. But yeah, Martyrs. This movie, man, this movie was so tough to watch. I actually split up my viewing of this. I watched the first half of it one night and then watched the second half like a couple of days later because I had to put this movie down. I could not watch it all in one sitting. This movie disturbed me so much that I could not watch it all in one sitting. So yeah, I watched it, I think it was last year, maybe, yeah, I think it was like about a year ago or so when I watched this movie. And what's really disturbing to this movie is not necessarily the torture and scenes of violence. There is plenty of that, yes. There are some very visceral and graphic scenes of torture in this movie that are just horrifying and terrible, just very difficult to watch. It's not fun. But what's really got to me about this movie, what I found to be the most disturbing about it, is the more psychological and emotional aspects of this movie. And I was not expecting that at all going into it. I was expecting this movie to be just like torture porn or something, kind of like Hostel, if you've seen the Hostel movies. This is not that at all. This is something far more sophisticated as well as more psychological, and you get kind of attached to these characters a little bit. These two female characters, the one girl that was tortured when she was a child, as well as her best friend that really cares about her and wants to help her. You really care about these characters, or at least I did while I was watching it. You feel a lot of sympathy for them, and they get wrapped up in this situation where they get in way over their heads and sort of dive back into this world. If they had chosen, or if the one girl had chosen not to get revenge, she might have, none of this might have happened, but because they get back into this situation, things go awry. And like I said, there's some other characters that come into play, and they are sort of swept back up in this world of this group of people and this torture and things that happen. Again, there's more to it than what I'm telling you, but I can't really say anything without spoiling it. So, but yeah, and it really puts a lot of emphasis on the trauma and the aftermath of these events. We get more screen time and scenes of the characters dealing with their grief and PTSD and things like that, rather than the torture itself. And that, to me, was the hardest to watch, the most difficult thing to experience, because the movie kind of lulls you in and kind of like sucks you into the story. It has a very well-written story, in my opinion. Like I said, it creates like sympathy for these characters. It makes you care about them a little bit. And it really just toys with your mind. And you're just expecting, these horrible scenes and of violence and things like that. And instead, what you get is something that really messes with your head. This is a very psychological movie, and that's something that gets to me a lot. I enjoy psychological horror. That's a subgenre I enjoy on a more lighter level, not quite to this level of extremity, but yeah, that's what really got to me about this one, and that's why it's at number 1 on my list of the top 5 most disturbing stories that I've ever experienced. And there also is one scene in this movie that, oh my God, it's not the end scene. A lot of people refer to the end scene that involves skin. I won't say anything further to spoil it. That one didn't really get to me so much as a scene that happens like a little bit past the halfway mark of this movie, where a certain character discovers another character being held captive. I'll just say that. That scene shook me to my core. That was just horrible, awful. I'll never get that image out of my head. I don't ever want to see that again. Kind of like I Saw the Devil. This is a movie that you watch one time and never watch again. It was a well-made movie. Looking back on it, I'm glad that I watched it. And it also has a lot of meaning to it and layers. Kind of like I Saw the Devil. It talks about revenge, about how it's kind of bittersweet, how it doesn't have like its desired outcome. Getting revenge is it's not the most satisfying thing. You're really just harming yourself by harboring all of this bitterness and this hatred towards others. So yeah, there's some like themes and layers to this movie you can kind of like extract and kind of like dig through a little bit. But yeah, Martyrs. This is a movie that I enjoyed looking back on it, but I will never watch it again because of just how disturbing it was. But it's a very well made movie. One other thing I do want to mention about it, I almost forgot, is the ending of this movie. So earlier I mentioned in more like extreme horror stuff, I like to have at least something to latch onto, whether it be likable characters or at least like that little bit of faint light. There has to be like some sense of hope to it, I guess. I don't want something just super bleak and depressing like Full Brutal. There's got to be something for me to latch onto. And this movie has just the smallest speck of that. Not much. This is a very dark and bleak movie as well, don't get me wrong. But at the end of this movie, we just get a little faint light of like hope, I guess you could say. Not even a good ending, but like somewhat of a good, like ambiguous ending to this. To where one of the characters being tortured, she has this sort of revelation on her deathbed, a vision, I guess you could say. She sort of, I won't get into too much detail and spoil it again, but she has this kind of vision of what's waiting for her on the other side as she's like on her deathbed and dying. And she reveals to the bad guys what this is and what's awaiting them. And this leads to one of the bad guys committing a certain act and leaving the rest of the bad guys in the dark and sort of awaiting the hell that will eventually come for them. I know that sounds very vague and kind of abstract, but this is a movie that if you can handle this kind of thing, if you know what you're getting into, I would rather you kind of see for yourself. Or if you've seen this movie already, you probably know what I'm talking about. So I really like the way this movie ended. Again, very well made movie, and I appreciated it and enjoyed some things about it, but again, it's just too disturbing to ever watch again in my lifetime. So yeah, that is my list of my top 5 most disturbing stories that I've ever experienced. And I would not recommend any of these, just so you guys know, especially if you're young, if you're older and you know what you're getting into. Check them out at your own risk. But yeah, this is just the top 5 most disturbing stories I've experienced personally. Feel free to share your comments down below. I am fully aware of other movies and books out there that probably far exceed these ones. But again, I've pretty much hit my limits. I'm content with having seen these. I do not plan on seeking out anything worse than this. I mostly read and watch movies to be entertained and just, yeah, to enjoy them. I'm not looking to like devastate myself with just this wretched and depraved content. So yeah, but I have seen these movies and books and decided to talk about them. So let me know down in the comments if you've seen any of these, what your thoughts are on them, or if you've experienced any books or movies that have just really disturbed you. Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. That's all I have for today, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.